Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she crouched behind a cluster of rocks in the middle of nowhere. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, and the blazing sun showed no mercy. 3 days ago, she had been part of a 5-person reconnaissance team sent to gather intelligence on enemy movements near the border. Now she was alone, abandoned by her own people, and deep in hostile territory. The mission had started like any other. Sarah and her team were experienced soldiers who had worked together for 2 years. They trusted each other completely, or so she thought. Their target was a remote outpost where enemy forces were reportedly planning something big. Intelligence suggested it was a weapons facility, but they needed concrete proof before any action could be taken. Everything went wrong on the second day. While moving through a narrow canyon, they encountered an enemy patrol. The firefight was intense but brief. When the smoke cleared, Sarah found herself separated from her team. She tried to reach them on the radio, but all she heard was static. Hours passed as she searched the area, calling out in whispers, hoping to find her teammates. What she discovered instead broke her heart and filled her with rage. Hidden behind some boulders, she found evidence that her own team had deliberately left her behind. Footprints in the sand showed they had regrouped after the fight and moved out together. Worse yet, she found a piece of paper with her name crossed out and the words, "Mission Compromised," written below it. Sarah realized she had been set up. Someone had decided she was expendable, perhaps even a liability. The thought made her stomach turn. These were people she had shared meals with, people she had saved in previous missions, people she considered family. Now they had abandoned her in enemy territory with limited supplies and no way home. As night fell, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She would not simply try to survive and escape. She would complete the mission they had all been sent to do. The enemy base was still out there, still a threat to her country and her people. If her own team thought she was not good enough to be part of their operation, she would prove them wrong by doing what they could not do together. She checked her equipment carefully. Her rifle had plenty of ammunition, and she still had her sidearm. Her backpack contained enough food and water for maybe 2 more days if she was careful. Most importantly, she had her combat knife, her explosives training, and 20 years of military experience. She had been underestimated before, but never by people she trusted. The enemy base was approximately 15 miles to the north, according to their intelligence briefings. Sarah had studied the satellite photos and memorized the layout. It was a small facility built into the side of a hill, with only one main entrance and a few guard towers. The report suggested maybe 30 to 40 enemy soldiers were stationed there, along with whatever weapons or equipment they were developing. Sarah spent the night planning her approach. She could not simply walk up to the front gate, and she did not have the heavy weapons needed for a direct assault. Instead, she would have to use stealth, intelligence, and the element of surprise. She would become a ghost, moving through their defenses without being detected until it was too late for them to respond. As the sun rose on her 4th day alone, Sarah began moving toward the enemy base. She traveled during the cooler morning hours, then rested in whatever shade she could find during the heat of the day. Her military training had taught her how to move across difficult terrain without leaving obvious tracks, and she used every trick she knew. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving. Sharp rocks cut through her boots, and the constant wind carried sand that stung her eyes and made breathing difficult. Several times she had to take cover when enemy patrols passed nearby. Each time she remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing and heartbeat until the danger passed. By evening, Sarah could see the enemy base in the distance. It looked exactly like the satellite photos, but seeing it with her own eyes made the challenge seem even more impossible. Guard towers were positioned at strategic points around the perimeter, and she could see soldiers moving between buildings. Bright lights illuminated the main areas, and she knew there would be sensors and alarms she could not see from this distance. That night, Sarah moved closer to get a better view of the facility. She spent hours watching the guards, timing their movements and looking for weaknesses in their security. What she discovered gave her hope. The enemy soldiers were not expecting any threat. Their patrols were predictable, their guards were sometimes distracted, and there were several blind spots in their coverage. More importantly, Sarah noticed something the satellite photos had not shown clearly. There was a drainage system that carried water away from the base during the rainy season. The pipes were large enough for a person to crawl through, and they appeared to lead directly under the main facility. It would be dangerous and uncomfortable, but it might be her way inside. As she prepared for what could be her final mission, Sarah thought about the teammates who had abandoned her. Part of her hoped they had made it safely home, but another part of her wanted them to know what she was about to accomplish alone. She would show them what real soldiers were capable of when they refused to give up. Sarah waited until the darkest hour before dawn to make her move. The guard rotation had just changed, and she had observed that the new sentries always took a few minutes to settle into their positions. This was her window of opportunity. She moved like a shadow across the rocky ground, using every piece of cover available to avoid detection. The drainage pipe entrance was located about 200 yards from the main gate, hidden behind a small hill covered with scrub brush. Sarah had to crawl on her belly for the last 50 yards, moving inches at a time whenever the searchlight swept past her position. The sand was cold against her skin and small rocks dug into her elbows and knees, but she ignored the discomfort. When she finally reached the drainage pipe, Sarah discovered her first real challenge. The entrance was covered with a metal grate that was secured with heavy bolts. She would need to remove it without making noise that might alert the guards. Using her combat knife and some tools from her pack, she worked carefully to loosen the bolts one by one. Each bolt took several minutes to remove, and Sarah had to stop frequently when she heard footsteps or voices nearby. Her hands were cramped and bleeding by the time she finally pried the grate free. The opening was smaller than it had looked from a distance, but it was large enough for her to squeeze through if she removed her backpack. The inside of the drainage pipe was even worse than Sarah had expected. The metal was corroded and sharp in places, and the smell of stagnant water and decay was overwhelming. She had to crawl forward on her hands and knees, pushing her backpack ahead of her through the narrow space. Every movement echoed slightly, and she prayed the sound would not carry to the surface. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah saw a light ahead. The pipe opened into a larger underground chamber that appeared to be part of the base's foundation. She emerged quietly and took a moment to assess her surroundings. The chamber was filled with pipes, electrical cables, and mechanical equipment that hummed and clicked in the darkness. Sarah checked her watch and realized she had been moving for over 3 hours. Dawn would be breaking soon, which meant increased activity above ground. She needed to find a way into the main facility before the base came fully alive for the day. Moving carefully through the mechanical room, she located a maintenance ladder that led to an access hatch in the ceiling. The hatch opened into a storage room filled with boxes of supplies and equipment. Sarah listened carefully at the door before opening it slightly to peer into the hallway beyond. The corridor was empty and dimly lit, with doors leading off in both directions. According to the building plans she had memorized, the main computer room and communications center should be somewhere on this level. Sarah moved down the hallway like a ghost, checking each room as she passed. Most were empty or contained only basic supplies, but in the fourth room, she discovered something that made her heart race. Stacks of weapons crates lined the walls, and she could see labels indicating they contained advanced missile systems and explosives. This was definitely more than just a simple outpost. As she continued exploring, Sarah heard footsteps approaching from around a corner. She quickly ducked into the nearest room and pressed herself against the wall beside the door. 2 enemy soldiers walked past, speaking in low voices about shift changes and breakfast schedules. Their casual conversation told Sarah that they had no idea an intruder was in their facility. When the soldiers had passed, Sarah emerged and continued her reconnaissance. She found the communications room exactly where the intelligence reports had indicated it would be. Through the small window in the door, she could see banks of radio equipment and computer screens, displaying various data. A single operator sat at the main console, apparently monitoring overnight communications. Sarah knew she needed to disable the communication system to prevent the enemy from calling for help once she began her main assault. But taking out the operator would require perfect timing and complete silence. She waited in the shadows beside the door, watching the operator's routine and looking for the right moment to strike. The opportunity came when the operator stood up to pour himself coffee from a pot in the corner of the room. Sarah slipped inside silently and approached from behind. Her military training took over as she applied a sleeper hold that rendered the man unconscious within seconds. She lowered him gently to the floor and immediately began sabotaging the communications equipment. Using her knife and some small explosive charges from her pack, Sarah systematically destroyed the radio transmitters and computer systems. She made sure to damage them in ways that would not be immediately obvious, so the enemy would not realize they were cut off from the outside world until they actually tried to send a message. With communications disabled, Sarah moved to the next phase of her plan. She needed to locate the main weapons storage area and plant explosives that would destroy the entire facility. The building plan showed a large underground vault where the most dangerous weapons were kept, but getting there would require passing through areas with more guards and security systems. Sarah made her way to a stairwell that led to the lower levels. Each step had to be taken carefully, as the metal stairs could easily make noise if she was not cautious. She paused at each landing to listen for sounds of activity below. The deeper she went into the facility, the more her respect for the enemy's operation grew. This was clearly a major weapons development site, not the small outpost their intelligence had suggested. At the third underground level, Sarah found what she was looking for. Heavy steel doors marked with warning symbols led to the main weapons vault, but the doors were secured with electronic locks and what appeared to be pressure sensors in the floor. Getting past these security measures would require all of her training and ingenuity. Sarah studied the security system carefully, looking for weaknesses she could exploit. The electronic lock had a keypad, but she had no way of knowing the correct code. The pressure sensors covered most of the floor area in front of the doors, but there appeared to be a narrow path along one wall where maintenance workers could walk without triggering alarms. Using this narrow path, Sarah was able to reach the doors without setting off the pressure sensors. The electronic lock proved more challenging, but her training in demolitions included techniques for bypassing security systems. After 15 minutes of careful work with specialized tools, she heard the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. The weapons vault was larger than Sarah had imagined. Rows upon rows of missiles, explosives, and advanced weapon systems filled the underground chamber. The sight made her realize just how serious the threat this facility posed to her country. This was not just a storage depot, but a major staging area for what could only be a planned attack. Sarah moved carefully between the weapon racks, documenting everything she saw with a small camera from her pack. The evidence she was gathering would be crucial if she somehow managed to escape and report back to command. But first, she needed to ensure these weapons could never be used against innocent people. She began placing explosive charges at strategic points throughout the vault. Her demolitions training had taught her exactly where to position the charges for maximum effect. The goal was not just to destroy the weapons, but to create a chain reaction that would bring down the entire facility. She worked methodically, using nearly all of her remaining explosives. As she placed the final charge, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps were approaching the vault, and she could hear voices speaking in urgent tones. Someone had discovered that the communication system was down, or perhaps they had found the unconscious operator. Either way, her presence in the facility had been detected. Sarah quickly activated the timers on her explosive charges, setting them for a 15-minute delay. That would give her time to reach a safe distance, but not much more. She needed to find another way out of the facility, as the route she had used to enter would likely be guarded now that they knew there was an intruder. The voices outside the vault were getting closer, and Sarah could hear running footsteps throughout the facility. Emergency alarms began blaring, and bright lights came on in areas that had been dimly lit before. The entire base was now on high alert, and dozens of soldiers would be searching for her within minutes. Sarah remembered seeing a ventilation grate in the ceiling of the vault during her reconnaissance. It was her only option for escape. She climbed up on a rack of missiles and used her knife to remove the screws holding the grate in place. The opening was tight, but she managed to pull herself up into the air conditioning duct just as the vault doors burst open below. From her hiding place in the ventilation system, Sarah could hear soldiers shouting to each other as they searched the vault. They had discovered her explosive charges and were frantically trying to disarm them. She knew they would not have enough time, especially since she had hidden the charges in places that were difficult to reach quickly. Sarah crawled through the air ducts as fast as she could, following the airflow toward what she hoped would be an exit to the outside. The metal ductwork was narrow and uncomfortable, and she had to move carefully to avoid making noise that would give away her position. Behind her, she could hear more soldiers entering the vault and shouting orders. The ventilation system led Sarah through several rooms and corridors before finally bringing her to an external vent on the side of the facility. She could see daylight streaming through the grate, and fresh air had never smelled so good. But as she prepared to kick out the grate and escape, she realized she had a problem. The external vent was located about 20 feet above the ground, on the side of the building facing the main courtyard. Dozens of soldiers were running around below, searching for the intruder who had penetrated their facility. If she tried to escape through this vent, she would be spotted immediately and probably shot before she could reach cover. Sarah checked her watch and realized she had less than 8 minutes before her explosives detonated. She needed to find another way out, or she would be caught in the blast she had created. Looking back through the ventilation system, she tried to remember if there had been any other external vents or openings she could use. Then she remembered something from the building plans she had studied. There was a secondary exit on the far side of the facility, near the motor pool where vehicles were stored. If she could reach that area, she might be able to steal a vehicle and escape before the explosives went off. But getting there would require leaving the relative safety of the ventilation system. Sarah backtracked through the air ducts until she found a grate that opened into a bathroom on the ground floor. She listened carefully to make sure the room was empty, then dropped down and immediately moved to the door. The hallway outside was chaos, with soldiers running in all directions and officers shouting conflicting orders. Using the confusion to her advantage, Sarah moved quickly but carefully toward the rear of the facility. She stayed close to walls and ducked into empty rooms whenever soldiers passed nearby. Her heart was pounding and sweat was pouring down her face, but her military training kept her focused on the goal of reaching the motor pool. The secondary exit was exactly where the building plans had indicated, but it was guarded by 2 soldiers with automatic weapons. Sarah realized she would have to take them out silently if she wanted to escape undetected. She approached from behind, using a storage room to get close to their position. The first guard went down before he knew what hit him, victim of Sarah's expert hand-to-hand combat training. The second guard started to turn when he heard his partner fall, but Sarah was already moving. Her knife found its target before he could raise his weapon or call out an alarm. Sarah dragged both bodies into the storage room and quickly put on one of their uniforms. It was too large for her, but in the chaos and poor lighting, it might be enough to fool casual observers. She checked her watch again and realized she had less than 4 minutes before the explosives detonated. The motor pool contained several vehicles, including trucks, armored cars, and motorcycles. Sarah chose a motorcycle because it would be faster and more maneuverable than the larger vehicles. She had learned to ride motorcycles during her military training, though it had been several years since she had been on one. The motorcycle started on the first try, and Sarah drove it slowly toward the main gate, trying to look like just another soldier responding to the emergency. The guards at the gate were focused on the search for the intruder inside the facility, and they barely glanced at her as she passed. She was outside the perimeter and accelerating down the access road when the first explosions began. The ground shook beneath her motorcycle as the charges she had planted began detonating in sequence. She looked back to see flames and smoke rising from the facility, and secondary explosions as the stored weapons began cooking off in the heat. The entire base was being consumed by a massive fireball that could be seen for miles in every direction. Sarah drove the motorcycle hard across the desert, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the destroyed facility. Behind her, the column of smoke continued to rise into the morning sky, marking the end of a major threat to her country's security. She had accomplished alone what her entire team had been sent to do together. The motorcycle carried Sarah across the harsh desert landscape for hours before the fuel finally ran out. She had pushed the machine to its limits, trying to put maximum distance between herself and the destroyed enemy facility. The explosion had been visible for miles, and she knew that enemy forces from other locations would soon be converging on the area to investigate what had happened. Sarah abandoned the motorcycle and began walking toward what she hoped was friendly territory. The sun was climbing higher in the sky and the temperature was becoming unbearable. She had very little water left and no food at all. Her stolen enemy uniform was too heavy for the desert heat, but she kept it on because it might provide some protection if she encountered more enemy patrols. As she walked, Sarah reflected on what she had accomplished. The enemy base was completely destroyed, along with all the advanced weapons it had contained. The intelligence she had gathered proved that the threat to her country had been much more serious than anyone had realized. But now she faced the challenge of surviving long enough to report her findings to her commanders. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, with no signs of civilization or friendly forces. Sarah used her military training to navigate by the sun and stars, but she knew that even experienced soldiers could become lost in this hostile environment. She rationed her remaining water carefully, taking only small sips when the thirst became overwhelming. By midday, the heat had become so intense that Sarah was forced to seek shelter. She found a small overhang of rock that provided some shade, and decided to rest until evening when the temperature would drop. As she sat in the meager shade, she thought about her teammates who had abandoned her. Their betrayal still hurt, but it had also revealed something important about her own strength and capabilities. While resting, Sarah heard the distant sound of aircraft engines. She looked up to see several enemy helicopters flying search patterns across the desert. They were obviously looking for survivors from the destroyed base, or perhaps searching for whoever had been responsible for the attack. Sarah pressed herself against the rock and remained perfectly still until the helicopters passed. That evening, as the sun began to set, Sarah resumed her journey across the desert. The cooler temperatures made walking easier, but the darkness brought new challenges. She had to move slowly to avoid falling into ravines or stepping on dangerous desert animals. Every sound made her freeze and listen carefully, as enemy patrols might still be in the area. On her second night alone in the desert, Sarah's water finally ran out. She knew that without water, she had perhaps one more day before dehydration would make it impossible to continue. The thought of dying alone in the desert after successfully completing her mission was almost unbearable. She had come too far to give up now. The next morning brought both hope and danger. Sarah spotted a small settlement in the distance with buildings and what appeared to be a well or water source, but she had no way of knowing whether the settlement was controlled by friendly forces or enemies. Approaching it would be a huge gamble, but staying in the desert without water was certain death. Sarah spent several hours observing the settlement from a safe distance. She counted approximately a dozen buildings and saw several people moving around, but she could not tell from their clothing or activities whether they were civilians, friendly soldiers, or enemy forces. There appeared to be vehicles parked near the largest building, which could be either a blessing or a curse depending on who controlled them. As evening approached, Sarah made her decision. She would approach the settlement under cover of darkness and try to determine who controlled it before revealing herself. If they were enemies, she might be able to steal water and supplies without being detected. If they were friendly, she could finally get help and begin her journey home. Sarah waited until full darkness before moving toward the settlement. She approached from the side where there were fewer buildings and more shadows to provide cover. As she got closer, she could hear voices and see lights in the windows of several buildings. The voices were speaking in a language she did not recognize, which made it impossible to determine their allegiances. The first building Sarah reached appeared to be a storage shed. She carefully tested the door and found it unlocked. Inside, she discovered exactly what she needed most: containers of fresh water and packages of dried food. She drank deeply and filled her empty water bottles, then stuffed her pockets with as much food as she could carry. As she prepared to leave the storage shed, Sarah heard footsteps approaching outside. She quickly hid behind some boxes and waited to see who would enter. The door opened and a young man stepped inside carrying a flashlight. He was wearing civilian clothes and did not appear to be armed, but Sarah could not take any chances. The man moved around the storage shed, apparently looking for something specific. When his back was turned, Sarah stepped out of her hiding place and grabbed him from behind, covering his mouth with her hand to prevent him from crying out. She whispered urgently in his ear, asking in several different languages whether he spoke English. To her amazement, the young man nodded and indicated that he understood English. When Sarah was confident he would not shout for help, she slowly removed her hand from his mouth. In whispered tones, he explained that the settlement was controlled by refugees who had fled from various conflicts in the region. They were not aligned with any military force and were simply trying to survive. The refugee explained that they had seen the massive explosion in the distance and had been wondering what had caused it. When Sarah briefly described what she had done, his eyes widened with amazement and respect. He told her that the enemy forces had been demanding tribute from their settlement for months, taking their food and supplies while giving nothing in return. Sarah realized that these people were potential allies, not enemies. She explained that she was a soldier who needed to return to friendly territory to report what she had discovered. The refugee, whose name was Ahmed, immediately offered to help. He explained that they had vehicles and knowledge of safe routes through the desert that could get her to the border. Ahmed led Sarah to meet with the other refugees, who welcomed her as a hero when they learned what she had accomplished. The enemy base she had destroyed had been a source of fear and oppression for communities throughout the region. Many of the refugees had family members who had been killed or captured by forces operating from that facility. The refugees provided Sarah with fresh clothes, a proper meal, and a place to rest safely for the first time in days. They also gave her detailed information about enemy positions and patrol routes between the settlement and the border. Most importantly, they offered to provide her with a vehicle and a guide who could help her reach friendly territory. That night, as Sarah prepared for the final leg of her journey home, she reflected on the unexpected allies she had found in the desert. These refugees had shown her kindness and support that her own teammates had failed to provide. They reminded her that the mission to destroy the enemy weapons cache had been about protecting innocent people like them. Sarah left the refugee settlement before dawn, accompanied by Ahmed's older brother Hassan, who knew the desert routes better than anyone in the community. They traveled in an old but reliable truck that Hassan had modified for desert travel, with extra fuel tanks and water supplies hidden beneath a false floor. The vehicle looked worn and unremarkable, which would help them avoid attracting attention from enemy patrols. Hassan proved to be an excellent guide and companion. He had spent years moving supplies and people through the desert, always staying ahead of the various military forces that controlled different areas. He knew where to find water, where to hide during the day, and which routes were safest at different times. His knowledge was keeping them both alive. Their first major challenge came on the second day of travel, when they encountered an enemy checkpoint that had not been there during Hassan's previous trips. The soldiers were stopping all vehicles and searching them thoroughly. Hassan and Sarah were forced to hide in the desert for several hours, while they observed the checkpoint and planned how to get past it. Hassan remembered an old smuggling route that bypassed the main road entirely. It was more dangerous and would add an extra day to their journey, but it would allow them to avoid the checkpoint completely. They waited until nightfall, then drove cross-country using only starlight for navigation. The terrain was rough and treacherous, but Hassan's experience kept them moving forward. During their time together, Hassan shared stories about life in the refugee settlement and the challenges his people faced every day. Sarah learned that many of the refugees were educated professionals who had been forced to flee their homes when the conflict began. They included doctors, teachers, engineers, and shop owners who now lived in poverty and constant fear. The enemy base that Sarah had destroyed had been responsible for many attacks on civilian targets throughout the region. Hassan told her about raids on markets, schools, and hospitals that had killed hundreds of innocent people. The weapons stored at that facility would have been used for even larger attacks if Sarah had not stopped them. Her actions had saved countless lives. On their third day together, Hassan and Sarah encountered another group of refugees who were traveling toward the settlement they had just left. These people were in terrible condition, having walked for days through the desert with very little water or food. Many were injured, and several children were showing signs of severe dehydration. Sarah and Hassan immediately stopped to help, sharing their water and food with the desperate travelers. Sarah used her military first aid training to treat the most seriously injured refugees, while Hassan organized the group and planned the safest route for them to reach the settlement. They spent several hours helping these people before continuing their own journey. The encounter with the refugee group reminded Sarah why her mission had been so important. These were the people who suffered when enemy forces were allowed to operate freely. Every weapon she had destroyed, every enemy soldier she had eliminated, meant fewer attacks on innocent families trying to survive in an impossible situation. As they got closer to the border, Hassan became more cautious about their route and timing. This area was heavily patrolled by both enemy forces and border guards who might not distinguish between refugees and enemy infiltrators. They would need to cross at exactly the right place and time to avoid being shot by nervous soldiers on either side. Hassan knew of a crossing point that was used by smugglers and refugees, but it was only safe during a narrow window of time when the patrol schedules of both sides created a brief gap in coverage. They would have to wait until the following night for this opportunity, which meant spending another day hiding in the desert. While they waited, Sarah used the time to organize her evidence and prepare her report. She reviewed the photographs she had taken of the weapons cache and made detailed notes about everything she had observed. The intelligence she carried was probably more valuable than anything her original team would have gathered, even if they had completed their mission successfully. Sarah also thought about what she would say to her commanders about being abandoned by her teammates. She had proof that they had deliberately left her behind, but she was not sure whether seeking justice for their betrayal was worth the disruption it would cause. Her focus was on reporting the intelligence she had gathered and ensuring that other enemy facilities were targeted for destruction. The night of their border crossing attempt arrived with perfect weather conditions. There was no moon, which provided maximum darkness for concealment, but the stars were bright enough for navigation. Hassan had timed everything perfectly, and they reached the crossing point exactly when the patrol schedules created their window of opportunity. The actual border crossing was one of the most tense moments of Sarah's entire ordeal. They had to drive slowly without headlights across rocky terrain, while avoiding detection by guards on both sides. Every sound seemed impossibly loud, and Sarah was certain they would be spotted at any moment. But Hassan's knowledge and timing proved accurate, and they made it across without incident. Once they were safely in friendly territory, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She was finally safe and could complete her mission by reporting to her commanders. But she was also leaving behind Hassan and the refugee community that had saved her life. These people would continue to face danger and hardship while she returned to the relative safety of her military base. Hassan refused any payment for his help, saying that destroying the enemy weapons facility was payment enough for his entire community. He asked only that Sarah remember the refugees when she made her report, and that she encourage her commanders to provide assistance to the displaced communities in the region. At the border outpost, Sarah identified herself to the guards and requested immediate transportation to her unit's headquarters. The guards were amazed to see her alive, as she had been listed as missing in action and presumed dead. Word of her survival and successful mission quickly spread up the chain of command. Within hours, a helicopter arrived to transport Sarah to the main military base where her commanders were waiting. As she flew over the desert that had nearly claimed her life, Sarah looked back toward the refugee settlement and thought about the brave people who had helped her complete her mission. She promised herself that she would never forget their kindness and sacrifice. The helicopter touched down at the main military base just as the sun was setting. Sarah climbed out of the aircraft to find a group of senior officers waiting for her, including General Morrison, the commanding officer of the entire operation. Their faces showed a mixture of relief, amazement, and curiosity. No one had expected to see her alive again, much less returning with a completed mission. General Morrison stepped forward and greeted Sarah personally, something that rarely happened with soldiers of her rank. He told her that her original team had reported her as killed in action during an enemy ambush. They had claimed that her body could not be recovered due to heavy enemy fire and had requested immediate extraction. The mission had been declared a failure and written off as a total loss. Sarah felt her anger rising as she heard this account of her abandonment. Her teammates had not only left her to die, but they had lied about the circumstances to cover their tracks. They had probably assumed she would never survive to contradict their story. The betrayal was even worse than she had originally thought. But General Morrison was more interested in hearing about Sarah's mission than discussing what had happened to her team. He led her to a secure briefing room where intelligence analysts were waiting with recording equipment and maps of the region. Sarah spent the next several hours providing a detailed account of everything she had observed and accomplished. The intelligence Sarah provided exceeded everyone's expectations. The facility she had destroyed was much larger and more important than their original intelligence had suggested. The photographs she had taken showed advanced weapon systems that posed a serious threat to regional security. Her detailed maps and observations would help identify other similar facilities in the area. When Sarah described the weapons cache she had destroyed, the analysts realized that she had probably prevented a major terrorist attack that would have killed thousands of civilians. The missiles and explosives stored at that facility were enough to level entire city blocks. Her lone mission had accomplished more than several large-scale military operations. General Morrison was particularly interested in Sarah's account of the refugee community that had helped her escape. He asked detailed questions about their location, their needs, and their willingness to provide intelligence about enemy activities in the region. Sarah emphasized that these people were valuable allies who deserved protection and support. The debriefing session lasted until well past midnight, with Sarah answering hundreds of questions about every aspect of her experience. The intelligence team was amazed by the level of detail she had observed and recorded during her infiltration of the enemy facility. Her military training and natural observational skills had produced a treasure trove of actionable intelligence. When the formal debriefing was finally complete, General Morrison dismissed the other officers and spoke privately with Sarah about her teammates' abandonment. He assured her that there would be a full investigation into what had happened and that appropriate action would be taken. No soldier should ever be abandoned by their team. Regardless of the circumstances, Sarah requested that any investigation focus on preventing similar incidents in the future rather than simply punishing her former teammates. She pointed out that seeking revenge would not undo what had happened, but improving training and accountability might prevent other soldiers from being abandoned. Her mature response impressed General Morrison even more. The general then delivered news that surprised Sarah completely. Based on her extraordinary accomplishment and the intelligence she had gathered, she was being recommended for one of the military's highest decorations for valor. Her solo destruction of the enemy facility would be studied as a model of individual initiative and tactical excellence. More importantly to Sarah, General Morrison informed her that a humanitarian mission was being organized to provide aid to the refugee settlements in the region. Her report about Hassan's community and the other displaced families had convinced headquarters that supporting these groups would serve both humanitarian and strategic purposes. The refugees could provide valuable intelligence while receiving the help they desperately needed. Sarah was assigned to lead the planning for this humanitarian mission, drawing on her knowledge of the region and her relationships with the refugee community. It would be her first assignment as a newly promoted officer, another surprise that General Morrison revealed during their private conversation. Her actions had demonstrated leadership qualities that her superiors wanted to develop further. Over the following days, Sarah worked closely with logistics officers and humanitarian specialists to organize supplies and personnel for the refugee mission. She insisted that Hassan's settlement be the first priority, as those people had saved her life and deserved immediate assistance. Medical supplies, food, clean water, and temporary shelter materials were loaded onto trucks for transport across the border. The investigation into her teammates' conduct proceeded quietly, while Sarah focused on her new responsibilities. She learned that the other members of her original team were being questioned about their version of events and their decision to abandon her. Evidence was mounting that their actions had been deliberate rather than the result of confusion during combat. One of her former teammates, Sergeant Williams, requested a private meeting with Sarah. During this uncomfortable conversation, he admitted that the team had deliberately left her behind because they believed she was taking unnecessary risks that endangered the entire mission. He claimed they thought she was dead when they decided to extract, but his explanation was contradicted by the evidence Sarah had found. Sarah listened to Williams' excuses with growing disgust. She realized that her teammates had been looking for a reason to abandon her long before the mission began. They had never respected her abilities or trusted her judgment, despite her proven track record. Their betrayal was rooted in prejudice and cowardice rather than legitimate tactical concerns. Williams asked for Sarah's forgiveness and begged her not to pursue charges against the team. He claimed that they had all learned from their mistake and would never abandon a teammate again. Sarah told him coldly that forgiveness was something he would have to earn through future actions, not words. She would not block the investigation, but she would not actively pursue revenge either. The humanitarian mission launched 2 weeks after Sarah's return. With her serving as the primary liaison with refugee communities, she flew back across the desert in a transport helicopter, this time accompanied by medical personnel, engineers, and tons of supplies. Seeing the landscape from the air reminded her of how close she had come to dying alone in that hostile environment. Hassan and his community welcomed the relief mission with tears of joy. They had never expected to receive help from any military force, as their experience had been limited to exploitation and violence. Sarah's return with aid and protection proved that not all soldiers were their enemies. The medical team immediately began treating sick and injured refugees, while engineers assessed their water and sanitation needs. During the mission, Sarah learned that other enemy facilities in the region had been located and destroyed, based on intelligence she had provided. The network of weapons caches and training camps was being systematically eliminated, making the entire area safer for civilian populations. Her solo mission had triggered a successful campaign that was bringing real security to the region. Sarah also discovered that word of her accomplishment had spread throughout the refugee communities. She was being hailed as a hero who had struck a blow against the forces that had terrorized them for years. Children in the settlements had begun playing games where they pretended to be brave soldiers like Sarah, sneaking into enemy bases and destroying weapons. The success of the humanitarian mission led to Sarah being offered a permanent assignment working with displaced populations and gathering intelligence from civilian sources. It was exactly the kind of work she wanted to do, combining her military skills with her desire to help innocent people caught in conflict zones. She accepted the position immediately. As Sarah established her new role, she reflected on how much her life had changed since being abandoned in the desert. The betrayal by her teammates had initially devastated her, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities she never knew she possessed. She had learned that she could accomplish extraordinary things when she refused to give up, regardless of how impossible the situation appeared. 6 months after her return from the desert, Sarah stood before a gathering of military officials and dignitaries as General Morrison pinned the Medal of Honor to her uniform. The ceremony was being held at the Pentagon, with representatives from allied nations in attendance. Her parents and siblings had traveled from across the country to witness the moment when their daughter received the highest military decoration for valor. The citation read aloud during the ceremony described Sarah's infiltration and single-handed destruction of the enemy weapons facility, but it could not capture the full scope of what she had accomplished. The ripple effects of her mission continued to benefit both military operations and civilian populations throughout the region. Her actions had proven that one determined individual could make a difference when facing seemingly impossible odds. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a young female cadet who asked for advice about pursuing a military career. The young woman explained that she had been inspired by Sarah's story and wanted to serve her country in similar ways. Sarah told her that the most important qualities for any soldier were determination, adaptability, and never giving up on your teammates or your mission. The investigation into her former teammates had concluded with disciplinary action for all 4 members of her original team. They had been demoted, reassigned to different units, and required to undergo additional training on military ethics and teamwork. Sarah felt no satisfaction from their punishment, but she hoped it would serve as a warning to other soldiers who might consider abandoning their comrades. Sergeant Williams had requested one final meeting with Sarah before being transferred to a remote assignment. During their brief conversation, he acknowledged that their treatment of her had been wrong and apologized sincerely for the first time. He admitted that their decision to abandon her had been motivated by jealousy and prejudice, rather than legitimate tactical concerns. Sarah accepted his apology, but made it clear that trust, once broken, was extremely difficult to rebuild. Sarah's new assignment working with refugee populations had exceeded all expectations. She had established relationships with dozens of displaced communities and created an intelligence network that provided valuable information about enemy activities. More importantly, the humanitarian aid program she helped coordinate had improved living conditions for thousands of families. Hassan had become her primary partner in the refugee assistance program, using his knowledge of the region and his relationships with displaced communities to identify those most in need of help. His settlement had been transformed into a model village with clean water, medical facilities, and educational programs for children. Other refugee communities were being developed using the same successful approach. The weapons facility Sarah had destroyed had been completely replaced by humanitarian infrastructure. Medical clinics, schools, and water treatment plants now occupied the area where missiles and explosives had once been stored. The change symbolized the transformation that was taking place throughout the region as military threats were eliminated and civilian needs addressed. Sarah had also been selected to train other soldiers in infiltration and demolition techniques, sharing the skills that had enabled her to complete her impossible mission. Her training programs emphasized not just tactical skills, but also the mental toughness required to persevere when everything went wrong. She taught soldiers to be self-reliant while never abandoning their commitment to their teammates. During one training exercise, Sarah encountered a young soldier who reminded her of herself before the desert mission. The soldier was skilled and determined, but had been excluded from certain assignments by teammates who questioned her abilities. Sarah took the soldier aside and shared her own experience, emphasizing that others' doubts could not define what someone was capable of accomplishing. The success of Sarah's programs led to her being promoted again, this time to the rank of major. At 35 years old, she was one of the youngest officers to reach that rank in her branch of the military. But the promotion came with increased responsibilities, including oversight of special operations throughout the region where she had first proven herself. Sarah's story had become legendary within military circles, inspiring books, documentaries, and training materials, but she was uncomfortable with the attention and preferred to focus on the practical work of helping refugees and eliminating threats to civilian populations. She knew that her real legacy would be measured in lives saved rather than awards received. 10 years after her mission in the desert, Sarah returned to Hassan's settlement for the anniversary celebration of the weapons facility's destruction. The former refugee camp had grown into a thriving town with permanent buildings, businesses, and a population that included many former refugees who had chosen to stay and build new lives. Hassan, now the elected mayor of the town, greeted Sarah as an honored guest and longtime friend. During the celebration, he spoke about how her courage had not only destroyed enemy weapons, but had also given hope to people who had lost everything. Her willingness to risk her life for strangers had shown that there were still good people in the world worth fighting for. As Sarah looked around at the bustling town that had grown from the refugee settlement, she reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. Being abandoned in the desert had been the worst experience of her military career, but it had also led to the most meaningful work she had ever done. She had learned that sometimes the greatest victories came not from following orders but from following your conscience. The children in the town still played games where they pretended to be brave soldiers, infiltrating enemy bases. But now they also played games about building schools and hospitals. Sarah realized that this was perhaps the most important change of all. The next generation was learning that heroism could take many forms, and that protecting innocent people was always worth any sacrifice required. Standing in the town square where Hassan's refugee camp had once struggled to survive, Sarah understood that her real mission had never been just about destroying weapons or completing assignments. It had been about proving that one person's refusal to give up could change the world for countless others. She had been abandoned by her teammates, but she had found a new team among the people she had chosen to serve and protect. The desert that had nearly claimed her life had become the foundation for everything meaningful she had accomplished since. Sarah Martinez, the soldier who had been left to die in hostile territory, had not only survived but had transformed herself into exactly the kind of leader the world needed. Her story would continue to inspire others long after her own service had ended, proving that true heroism was not about recognition or rewards, but about never abandoning hope or the people who needed protection most.